Welcome back to Night Watch. Dr. Buck Ruxton thought that by cutting off his victims' fingertips and dismembering their bodies, he could hide their identities. But it was the Sunday newspaper he used to wrap up the body parts that helped the police solve the crime. And by using new forensic techniques, it wouldn't be long before they made a house call on the not-so-good doctor. Nick Martin takes up the story.
A mile or so north of the town of Moffat is one of the wildest and most beautiful parts of southern Scotland. This is the land where border reivers used to hide their stolen cattle in the 15th and 16th century. It was also the place where, in September 1935, a Lancaster doctor called Buck Ruxton scattered the remains of two women he'd murdered in his home. Dr. Ruxton's destination was here, the Garden Home Lynn, a tributary of the River Annan, just a few miles outside Moffat on the way to Edinburgh. For the Lancaster GP, it seemed the perfect spot to dispose of the numerous body parts of his two victims. What the discovery of these remains led to was a groundbreaking investigation for the world of forensic science.
It's a landmark case because of the nature and extent of the mutilation of the victims. This required the development of sophisticated techniques in order to reconstruct the body parts, and also improving the identity of the victims, and also the techniques which were used to actually convict Ruxton.
Buck Ruxton was born in Bombay, India, in 1899. He studied medicine at Bombay University, and after qualifying in 1922, he worked for a hospital in the city. He met and married a local girl, but when he moved to Edinburgh in 1927, he left her behind in the city. It was while studying to become a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons in the Scottish capital that he met Isabella Kerr. She would later become his common-law wife and call herself Isabella Ruxton.
He arrived in Lancaster in 1930. He set up home with Isabella, and that's where they had their 3 children. They employed a nursemaid, Mary Rogerson, to come and work for them at the 2 Dalton Square, and that's where he set up his surgery. According to people in Lancaster, he was a very well-liked doctor. He was very friendly. He waived a lot of fees for the people, you know, that came to see him who couldn't afford to have treatment.
Well, my father was in Lancaster Borough Police at that time. I suppose he'd be in his late 20s. And as I recall, Dr. Buck Ruxton was the police surgeon. And so he being a police officer, the two would get to know each other, I would think, fairly well. My father once had his nose broken as a result of a fracas somewhere, and it wasn't the approved thing for an injured police officer to be seen walking about with a broken nose. One night he was on the corner outside Dr. Ruxton's house, and the doctor said, "What's wrong with your nose, Wilson?" So my father explained the situation, so he took him into the surgery and fixed his nose there and then. And my father never ever got a bill for that. But I think that's the sort of fellow that Dr. Ruxton was.
But not everything was as it seemed. Dr. Ruxton was emotionally unstable and obsessively jealous of his common-law wife, Isabella. Arguments between the two were frequent, and the police were called several times to their home here in Dalton Square.
By all accounts, they used to argue all the time. There's one report that he used to have his hands round Isabella's throat and the maid was told to sort of go away, mind her own business. He had a revolver kept underneath his pillow. He threatened her with a carving knife.
As a result of one of these disturbances, where Ruxton was particularly agitated, and I gather he went into not quite a tantrum, but he clearly agitated, and he would sound off all sorts of odd remarks. And I think one of them was something like, "There'll be 2 murders in Dalton Square tonight." And I rather think my father made a note of that into his pocketbook.
I think it was very important for Dr. Ruxton to be a good clinician and a good doctor, because he'd grown up in an atmosphere where achievement and becoming a doctor was very important. So that he had this great capacity in his role as a doctor to be calm, professional, friendly, well liked by people, but yet in his own personal life he was this volatile, jealous, unable to control the situation, losing his temper kind of person. There was almost a split in his personality.
It all happened on the night of the 14th of September 1935. Isabella had said to Buck Ruxton that she was going to Blackpool to see the illuminations with her 2 sisters that were holidaying down there. She took the Hillman Minx, Buck Ruxton's motor car, and said that she'd be back later that night. And she went off as far as, you know, that was the last people saw her. She went off in the car to Blackpool. What we think may have happened is, obviously, she returned that night from Blackpool, and Buck, being like he was, a very jealous individual, he's accused her of going off with another man or sort of meeting someone in secret down there. And the general consensus is that some arguments sort of ensued.
I think possibly there was a build-up of jealousy, fear and so on, and he wanted to control her, he wanted to possess her, he didn't want anybody else to have her, so he then erupted. It was a momentary explosion. I think it got out of control, worse than it had been before in his life, and he killed her.
But there was one witness to the murder. Ruxton's housemaid, Mary Rogerson, had heard a row between the doctor and Isabella and had gone to investigate. Then, to conceal his first murder, he killed her as well. Ruxton's 3 children were in the house at the time of the murders. It's not known whether or not they slept through the events of the night. The next day, Ruxton took the children to stay with a close family friend and then returned to his home in Dalton Square.
He now had 2 victims. He dismembered them on the shelf in the bathroom. Some of the dismembering was also done in the bath. The bodies were drained of blood. The actual process of dismembering took a minimum of 5 hours for Isabella. Mary Jane Rogerson was dismembered over a period of 2 to 3 hours.
Sometimes when people get involved in horrific crimes or accidents or whatever, they suddenly switch into a detached mode, which is to deal with the situation. And I think Dr. Ruxton's skills as a surgeon became his focus. He could then use this to protect himself by cutting up the body, disposing of the body. He could then protect himself even further by cutting off quite skillfully identifying features to make it more difficult for the parts of the body when they're discovered to be identified. So he'd almost gone into this detached mode.
He wrapped them up in paper, in a pair of woolen rompers, in bed sheets, anything he could really, and packed it with straw. And then he left these bundles, we think, in some of the rooms and locked them and left it till the next morning.
Ruxton explained the blood splatters within his house to his cleaner, saying that he'd accidentally cut his hand with a tin opener while opening a tin of peaches. and hence there was blood on his suit and on the carpet. And there are a few theories. Either he accidentally cut himself when he was dismembering the bodies, or he cut his hand deliberately to cover up the fact that there was blood everywhere in the house from the two victims.
When the charwoman was washing up, doing some work in the kitchen, I think it might have been on Tuesday, after he'd committed the murder on the Friday night, she saw Buck Ruxton go to his car and take several bundles and put them in the back of his car. He set off in his car with the body parts in the back and went up to Moffat, and just outside Moffat, on a bridge over the River Lynn, is where he sort of threw these bundles down.
It was on the 29th of September 1935 when the first body parts came to light. A woman out walking near Moffat stopped by this bridge, peered over the edge and noticed an arm lying in the ravine below. The discovery led to a groundbreaking investigation into the murders of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson. The shocking discovery of human body parts near Moffat marked the beginning of what was to become a landmark criminal investigation.
Well, the Buck Ruxton case, I believe, is one of the cases which are of great academic interest, even now, and they'll remain so for everyone who's interested in forensic pathology and forensic science, because this case showed us that the forensic cases are solved not by a single person, but it's always a team effort.
One of the leading figures in the team was John Glaister Jr., who was Professor of Forensic Medicine at Glasgow University. Another was Professor James Cooper Brash, who was Professor of Anatomy at the University of Edinburgh. There were also other forensic experts and police from both sides of the border.
The challenge that faced the investigators at the time was to prove that all the bits and pieces, dismembered bits and pieces, belonged to one another, and also that they belonged to the two individuals that were involved. So they had really two tasks, and they had to demonstrate this beyond all reasonable doubt in order to secure the conviction.
Once the body parts had been recovered, they were taken to a temporary mortuary in Moffat. And then it became apparent to John Glaister Jr. and James Cooper Brash that in order to go about the reconstruction of the bodies, it would be necessary to take them to a laboratory with better facilities. So all the body parts were taken to the anatomy department at the University of Edinburgh, where reconstruction took place.
Professor Glaister first of all documented all the body parts. There were 70, I think, in all. He documented them, he wrote them in a very professional manner, and I had the opportunity of seeing his diary where he noted these things.
Well, at first it was thought the body parts were male. It was only through innovative reconstruction work by forensic scientists that revealed their true female identities. As for Dr. Ruxton, he was protesting his innocence long before anyone suspected he'd done anything wrong. We'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back to Night Watch. As scientists were piecing together the body parts, it was a simpler clue that helped catch the killer, a newspaper used to wrap up the victims. It was to prove vital in linking Dr. Ruxton to the bodies.
But Ruxton's reaction after the murders was very erratic. He went to the police station several times and actually became quite a pest to them, declaring his innocence, saying he hadn't killed anybody and trying to account for the disappearance of his wife and maid. And this was actually at a time when, before the bodies had even been found, and when they had been found, they initially thought it was the bodies of two men. Some of the remains were wrapped in the Sunday graphic newspaper, which was a slip edition, only available to 3,700 homes in the Lancaster area.
The newspaper gave the police a link to Lancaster, where a Dr. Ruxton had reported that his wife and housemaid were missing. But this was only one line of inquiry. In Scotland, investigators still hadn't identified the bodies.
The bodies were infested with maggots, and so they needed to be cleaned and preserved before the actual reconstruction could take place. And by the 11th of October, the professors had managed to reconstruct the bodies and determine that they were the remains of two women.
The job of the scientists was to demonstrate that the remains had actually been lying around for about 14-15 days. And the way they did that was by examining the maggots, the larvae of the green fly. As maggots grow, they go through different stages which can be identified by an expert, and each of these stages has a certain time sequence. So the first stage takes about 36 hours, the second stage takes about 2 or 3 days, and then the third stage takes about 7 days, which gives you a period of about 12 days. And they then added to that the fact that the green fly would have laid the eggs within 1 or 2 days of the remains being laid outside. So they were able to estimate that the remains had been lying around 16 days, which tied in with the date. They were found on the 29th, and the date in the paper said the 15th of September.
At the time, Scotland was more advanced in forensic science and forensic pathology than England was. Largely the doctors, Glaister, who were working in Edinburgh, and forensic scientists working in Glasgow, were developing new techniques, were being experimental, and they were ahead of the field at the time.
But the scientists still had to find some way of proving that the two skulls discovered were those of Isabella Ruxton and Mary Rogerson. For that, Professor Brash came up with an ingenious solution.
2 photographs of each of the victims were enlarged, and these were used as the basis of photographic superimposition, using 2 photographs of skulls of the victims. The 2 sets of negatives of the portrait and the skull were superimposed photographically, and prints were made, and the idea was to join up the portrait with the anatomical landmarks in order to say one skull was the remains of Isabella Ruxton and the other was Mary Rogerson.
On the 12th of October, Ruxton went to the police station and was asked to account for his movements between the 14th and the 20th of September. In a vain attempt to cover his tracks, he produced a document called My Movements. My Movements was a diary, a record of his whereabouts from the night his wife and housemaid disappeared on the 14th of September.
The reaction of going to the police station and all the attempts to cover the tracks were really rather ham-fisted, and I'm quite surprised then that he hadn't actually been more skillful with it, because he looked almost doomed to get caught with bits of carpets lying around with blood on them, and I think panic set in.
One of the things in My Movements, Ruxton wrote down how he'd cut his hand, because he'd severed it actually quite deeply, and he'd cut it down to the bone, and he put in My Movements, "So I cut my hand this morning on a tin of peaches." But it's probable that he did it dismembering the bodies. I think the police had an eye on Ruxton all the time. Ever since sort of his wife and maid disappeared, obviously, you know, they obviously had a seed of doubt in the back of their mind.
A day after being questioned, Ruxton was charged here at the Lancaster Police Court with the murder of Mary Rogerson. On the 5th of November, he was charged with the murder of Isabella Ruxton. His subsequent trial at the High Court of Justice in Manchester lasted 11 days, during which time he was held at Strangeways Prison.
My father was a licensed driver, and I suppose back in the 1930s there wouldn't be too many police drivers around. I mean, now they're everywhere, but in those days there would be very few. Because of the fairly close relationship with Ruxton, my father would stop the vehicle and go and get Ruxton fish and chips because he had a great liking for fish and chips.
He had an auction to sell off pretty much all of his entire house contents to pay for the best solicitor that money could buy. And obviously, you know, that's not something that sort of a man who thinks he'd be found innocent would do.
The evidence against Buck Ruxton was overwhelming. It took the jury just over an hour to reach their verdict. Found guilty of murder, the judge sentenced Ruxton to death.
My father was very sad. He had to give the evidence against Dr. Ruxton, but I could tell that things weren't quite right in the house, and I could tell my father was a bit upset.
But Ruxton, you know, obviously pleaded his innocence right up until sort of the week before he was hanged, when he made a confession, for money might I add, to the News of the World. And now whether he did that for his children, to provide them money after his death, or whether it was a real confession of guilt, no one will ever know. But there was a rumour going around Lancaster that a friend of his went to visit him in prison just before he was hanged, and he said, you know, once I've died, the truth will come out. So I don't know whether Buck Ruxton did it for the money or it was a true confession.
Buck Ruxton had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, but his subsequent appeal against the death sentence was later dismissed. After the failure of his appeal to the Lord Chief Justice, Buck Ruxton was hanged at Strangeways Prison in Manchester on the 12th of May 1936. Almost 70 years on, this case is still regarded as a turning point in criminal investigations.
So, two murderers who failed to cheat the hangman, partly thanks to developing forensic techniques. These days, the preservation of a crime scene and the evidence it reveals is absolute, ensuring murders, old and new, can be solved. Well, that's all from me and the Night Watch team. Do join us again.